Hello everyone, and before we get on to the grand old story that never was of Task Force 34, this video has been kindly sponsored by World of Warships Legends. As you probably know, I play World of Warships on PC myself. World of Warships Legends, on the other hand, is the version for all you console players out there. It's available for download free on PlayStation or Microsoft Store, depending on your console of choice, of course. I recommend not trying to download the Xbox version from the PlayStation Store or vice versa, although I suppose you could try. Once in-game, you can pick your favourite nation from a range of in-game options, grab a commander, choose a ship that suits your playstyle, and head on up that ship's tech tree. This month, World of Warships Legends is 2 years old, if you count from the time of the first beta weekend, and so there's going to be all sorts of celebrations and activities to take part in, and a new class of ships being introduced, the dreaded aircraft carriers, which will show up in the form of Tier 3, Tier 5 and Tier 7 ships for the US Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy respectively. If you want to see the ships that you can command and download the game, head over to the link in the video description just below. And now on with the show. This channel has talked a lot about battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers, all sorts of fun and games, but what was it like to command one of these ships? What was the job? What were the perks? What was the fun? What was the more serious aspects of it? Well, that's not really something that someone who studies history can tell you in full. Really, you want to know about that from someone who's lived that history, someone who's actually commanded one of these great ships. But I hear you say, surely all the ships that your channel covers will have been out of service for 70 years or so. Chances of somebody who captained one of them still being around are rather slim. Well, you might think that, but remember, a few of these ships did actually make it much, much further down the line. For example, the Iowa-class battleships. So, why don't we hear from someone who actually commanded one? In fact, someone who commanded USS Iowa herself. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this particular show. We're going to be talking, well, for those of you who are watching, obviously not live, but I'm talking live, to Larry Seaquist, formerly captain of the USS Iowa, BB-61 herself, possibly one of the most well-known warships in the world, and currently a museum ship on the US West Coast, if I'm not mistaken. I guess I can call you Captain.
Or Larry, please.
Or Larry, fair enough. So Captain Larry, I guess, has kindly volunteered to give us a little bit of a rundown of what it was like to run the Iowa herself, which is not a perspective you'll get every day. So very lucky to have this. So as usual, we've got our 10 questions. Obviously, we're recording this via Zoom because, well, one, flying out to the US is quite expensive, and two, at the moment, that's even more problematic than it usually is. So forgive any errors in the Zoom data feed or whatever. Those are entirely my fault, but hopefully that won't be much of a problem. So I guess, well, first thing, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the viewers and just explain a little bit about who you are and what you did in the Navy.
Thank you. Yes, and I'm going to take the hat off now that I've authenticated that my Battleship Iowa hat. I'm Larry Seaquist, a retired Navy captain. I'm coming to you today from Gig Harbor, appropriately, Gig Harbor, Washington. It's a little seaport village south of Seattle on Puget Sound. My wife and I, she's a writer, we retired here after my 32-year career in the Navy. I followed that career with 8 years in the Washington State Legislature. And I am now working on a book about democracy, strategy of democracy, which in part draws on my experience in the Navy. We're going to talk about the seagoing side of my career. The other half of my career ashore was largely as a political military strategist in the Pentagon.
Fun times. So I guess with the first question we've got there is, could you give us an idea of the various ships you served on before you actually took command of Iowa?
Well, I was a farm boy, born in Idaho, grew up on a farm in Oregon. So, like many farm boys, I went to sea. In my case, I enlisted in the US Navy because they were about to draft me. And I enlisted aboard a diesel boat. At the time, I was in Washington, D.C., and had just finished 3 years of polar operations in the Antarctic and the Arctic. But my first ship was USS Drum, is an old World War II diesel boat, no batteries. It was just a training ship in D.C. And I went to sea on a diesel boat in Norfolk, out of Norfolk, where I did what all seaman recruits do: start tracing pipes. Once I got a commission, by the way, I went to boot camp the day after I graduated from college and got my real education, and then applied for OCS, got a commission. And my first ship was the cruiser Northampton. It was the command cruiser that was the alternative national command post. That was a good tour of duty for me because I became the assistant navigator, got to live on the bridge, and really got, as a brand new officer, got a real good seagoing education in navigation, seamanship, ship handling, and what a large ship looked like. From there, I became a destroyer sailor, went to sea on a briefly. My XO said, you ought to stick around the Navy and go try this destroyer. So he sent me to sea on an old Fletcher class four piper for a couple of weeks. And despite the stack gas, I came back as a dedicated destroyer sailor. And so I served as ASW officer, anti-submarine warfare officer on USS D'Amato, a Fram 1. Then after school, came back as weapons officer on USS O'Hare, another Fram 1. And then I was fortunate enough as a lieutenant, this was during the Vietnam years, to get command of a patrol gunboat, PG-99 USS Beacon. We were built in the Great Lakes, commissioned in Boston, moved through Suez Canal to San Diego, and then they started shutting down the war just as we were ready to sail for Vietnam. So we ended up coming back to Norfolk with that ship. So I went to shore for the first time to the Pentagon after 7 years at sea and one command. And from there, I had three more commands. I tell people I had a small, medium, and large, and extra large. The Beacon, after my first Pentagon tour, then I commanded the frigate Braunstein FF 1037, the Spruance class destroyer David R. Ray, and then Battleship Iowa.
Oh wow! So it's yeah, I guess going from a Spruance to the Iowa, you could almost use your previous ship as a ship's launch for the next one.
Indeed, but I'll tell you, Drac, one of the interesting things that is, no matter how big or small the ship, the role of the captain is the same. And I realize as a four-striper with 1,600 people in the crew that basically I was doing the same thing with a lot more people than I was as a lieutenant with a crew of 31. And I think it's very important that we remember that the sea is a very big place. And no matter how big the ship looks, it's still a pretty small speck on that ocean with sailors taking it to sea.
Yeah, yeah. It's the sea is always bigger,
Yeah.
no matter what you're on. So
I remember going to sea once, speaking about big versus small. I was Iowa. We were getting underway from Norfolk on Seedy Tail, going out the channel, heading toward what we call VA Capes, the Virginia Capes operating area. And I had embarked a young newspaper reporter who was with me on the bridge. And I realized as he was standing beside me asking questions that he was looking at me as perhaps the most powerful individual he had ever seen. Everything appeared to be under my control, giant ship, big guns, commands going on. I spent the next 2 days while he was at sea with us, sending him around the ship so that he could understand that who was actually in charge were the sailors on the deck plates and their chiefs, their petty officers and chiefs. That these our ships are run from the crew up, not from the captain down.
Yeah, and I suppose that's one of the, I suppose even going back to the Second World War, when I've had a look at the way the U.S. Navy ran its ships and sort of developed its command style through that conflict, that is one of the things that distinguishes the U.S. and certain other allied navies from some of the other navies, in that it's not a kind of authoritarian, almost feudal style. The captain has said this, therefore thou shalt do this, regardless of any other sense. There is quite a lot of freedom, and
Right.
obviously not necessarily disrespectful talk back, but if a lower ranking officer thinks that doesn't really seem to be quite the wise decision, you might get a very respectful, sir, are you entirely sure that is what you want to
And
do?
sometimes delightfully blunt.
Yes.
It's important to remember, but I felt in the American Navy, that crewman is a fellow citizen. He has one vote just like you do. He's paying taxes just like you are. And in one sense, we are all citizens together, serving our country.
Yeah. So when you took command of the Iowa, obviously it's the middle of the 1980s. What was the main role for the ship during its time under your command? Because it wasn't too recently out of mothballs at that point.
Right. And let me start the story. As you remember, back in the early 80s, when President Reagan became president and John Lehman became the Secretary of the Navy, Secretary Lehman had this vision of a 600 ship Navy. He wanted to grow from 550 to 600 ships. And in order to do that, and not just build a Navy around battles or carrier battle groups, he wanted to bring the 4 battleships back and build battle groups around the battleships. That would give you more capital maneuvering, more capital ships to maneuver. It was a brilliant idea. And the first one brought back was New Jersey. So New Jersey commission was based on the West Coast, and as soon as they got that ship back into commission, and this connects to my role, explain how this would be important to me. When New Jersey was put into commission, she had briefly been restored for a year in Vietnam, put back in mothballs, back out again, brand new crew. They decided to give the ship and the crew a breathing space to kind of get used to the new ship, Navy to learn about battleships back in the water again. And so New Jersey was sent in 83 on a Westpac cruise. During that Westpac, I think the date was 23 October 1983, is when the Marines were blown up by that terrorist bombing in Beirut. Massive American security crisis. So New Jersey was sped back across the Pacific, through the Suez Canal, across the Atlantic. They changed COs in Gibraltar, flew a new CO because the other one had his time elapsed. Another guy ready to take over. And they plunked New Jersey down immediately off the coast of Beirut. And she sat there doing 3-knot U-turns for weeks. Very little firing time throughout that. And then suddenly the White House decided they wanted to fire at some bad guys in the mountains above Beirut. So they ordered Battleship New Jersey to fire into those hills. Now that poor crew, they were wonderful people, but they had not yet even done basic gunnery shakedown, and nobody knew exactly what the exact coordinates of those targets were that the White House wanted to fire. Later on, I was able to interview the people involved. That firing was wildly inaccurate. It embarrassed the Navy. And I was in the pipeline ready to become the second CO of Iowa. Iowa's in the refitting time during this. So my instructions from the Secretary of the Navy himself were to go make sure the battleships could shoot accurately. And I had, unusually, my orders came directly from the Secretary. So when I got to the ship, my last admiral's visit with my type commander in Norfolk, the admiral said to me, Larry, you do the shooting, I will do the counting. You have no limits on training ammunition. So, I was one happy sailor. I love gunnery. So we went to sea with some wonderful gunnery people. Now deceased Commander Gene Cosmic was the gunnery officer, a fabulous Master Chief Chuck Hill, a fabulous gunner's mate all the way back to Korea, new big guns. And gradually taught ourselves, trained the crew, got the Cosmoline out of the guns, and became the most accurate firing battleship in history. By the time the end of the story. Now, we were assigned to finish this story. We were assigned to go to Operation Earnest Will to help escort tankers through the Straits of Hormuz. But we had not yet proven to Secretary Lehman that we had met his instructions to me. So I was in the Med. We were on our way through to schedule to go to the Suez Canal, but I had to do a qualifying fire in the Aegean Sea. The Greeks had a little rock, a little island called Avgonisi. And we pulled in on Avgonisi. By that time, we had the RPVs, Pioneers aboard, and did a day-long gunnery exercise to demonstrate how accurately we were shooting. That report I sent up the chain of command. Within hours, I had a green light that we had met the Secretary's criteria. The battleships were cleared to go back into action. So that was my story, basically, is to get the ship in commission and to show that these battleships really are what Lehman and Reagan thought they could be. And they turned out to be fabulous, of course.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, I mean, even just you see some of the pictures from the 1980s of the ship sailing with its surface action group. And I mean, apart from the sheer size of it, obviously, but quite often I've heard it said that you can tell which ship is the battleship because it's the best looking ship in the squadron.
Absolutely.
I mean, to be fair, it doesn't help that the US Navy, to be honest, they went through that long period of just putting a gigantic block on top of an otherwise fine hull for radar purposes, but still. The Iowas still are a very, very unique looking style of vessel.
And Drac, for the naval historians among your viewers and readers, it's important to remember that after World War I, the London naval treaties imposed a set of building limits on battleships. And the US Navy, like the Brits, was building little groups of 2 or 3 battleships and refining designs. We finally declared in the middle 1930s, the US did, that the Japanese had violated the Washington-London naval treaties with the Congo-class cruiser. We claimed that they had exceeded their tonnage limits. That gave us, under the treaty, 10,000 tons. That 10,000 tons on top of the previous classes gave us this brilliant Iowa design, a superb hull, a perfect balance between speed, armor, installed equipment. It was just the sweet spot of capital ship design.
So you mentioned you've got this wonderful ship. You've got a blank check to shoot all the guns,
right,
which is possibly one of the best sentences I could ever think of hearing aboard a ship, especially something like that.
We used to say, a day without gunnery is a day without sunshine. We shoot 6 days a week. And if you want to shoot on Sunday, just ask. We'll do that too.
So what was it like to conduct a full gunnery exercise on Iowa?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of people involved. Because we fired so much, we would often not put the full crew to general quarters. We would button up around the turrets and the magazines and but there were upwards of 40 to 50 people in each of those three turrets, counting the crews in the turret magazine people. Each of those turrets, by the way, is about 1,800 tons of machinery that rotates, and they rotate on roller bearing paths that are just amazingly accurate. You could lay those guns. The machinery is just spectacular. By the way, the materials of the Iowa, the quality of the steel, this was some of the biggest armor ever cast at the time. The ship was built by women largely in Brooklyn Naval Shipyard. Another interesting thing is, what size is a battleship? What decided that? I mentioned the treaties. The size of a battleship is decided by the width of the Panama Canal. It had to be slightly less than 110 feet, and it had to get under the Brooklyn Bridge when it was commissioned. So you will see that the uppermost part of the forward mast has a place where you can add more on top of it. That goes under the Brooklyn Bridge. So that's the size of a battleship.
Yeah, and I suppose when you're doing the gunnery, obviously you've got these 16-inch 50 caliber guns, the main guns. But by the 1980s, that's not the only equipment or the latest equipment on the ship. So, what other technology did you get to use during your sort of new technology? Did you get to use it during your time in command?
Yeah, and I want to come back to what your question was about actually doing gunnery with 16-inch guns. So yeah, during the refitting for the 80s, we added both the Tomahawk cruise missiles and with a nuclear weapons capability, and the Harpoon missiles. So what you had was this symphony of firepower. Again, Drock, if you go back to look at the original design, even without the missiles, it was brilliant. The design of the main battery plots, the secondary battery plots, the 5-inch plotting rooms with those old electromechanical computers. Those old computers could lay those guns more accurately, because we tested them side by side, than modern digital computers. Just wonderful machinery. And it was really a pleasure. I enjoyed being around machinery that was so well designed, so well thought through, and the intricate relationships between three turrets, in our case, 6 guns. There originally were 10 5-inch 38 guns. I'd grown up with a 5-inch 38 gun. That's the only one I could take apart myself. But having all that firepower was really a remarkable thing. So here's a way to think about it. We didn't think much about sea battles anymore, but if you did, you could fire a long-range cruise missile. You could shoot a Harpoon at 60 miles, close in, start long-range gunnery at 20 miles, and then keep going all the way down to 5-inch range with this symphony of firepower. Our main focus, of course, was shore fire.
Shore-based firepower.
Now, for gunnery itself, we did wear a hearing protection, but and you needed that if you were down on the main deck. What was really important is to understand, and when the guns fired, you could feel like this oven opened, just this flash of heat. A little interesting thing, the guns, when you fire a 3-gun turret, you fire center, left, right guns. And there is a thing called an agistat, an old electrical device that slows down the firing trigger, so that if you've got all 3 guns loaded and connected to plot, when plot pulls the trigger, the guns will go boom, boom, boom. And that distance we had to adjust. When they recommissioned, so the basic idea is center gun fires, left gun fires, that deforms the turret slightly to the left. You need to give the turret time to get back on the gun line, or the right gun will shoot to the left of the center and left guns. That timing had to be shifted in the modern recommissioning because the shock waves of the center and left gun would overlap itself at the CWIS installations. And the shock wave would crush the electronics inside the CWIS radome. So we retimed that to be center gun 400 milliseconds to the second gun and 1,000 milliseconds a second to right gun. So it would go boom, boom, boom.
So kind of a ripple fire.
And you could, if you fired all three turrets simultaneously, of course, if you look, you can see those projectiles. Those are big projectiles. Small ones were 1,965 pounds, something like that. The heavyweights are up to 2,400 pounds. You could see those projectiles on their way out.
Yeah, I think that
another reason for the timing is to make sure that the projectiles are not running side by side so that they don't collide.
Yeah, I found that quite fascinating when especially when I was reading it. I mean, it was a fraction before the Iowa's time, but during the second night action at the naval battle of Guadalcanal, where you had Washington firing, and yeah, a lot of people, they think, oh well, you fire the guns and you see pictures and you see the flare of the muzzle blast, and then people think, oh, and that's it. You kind of just that, and then maybe you see an explosion several seconds later. But then with the description from the gunners on Washington, they were watching their shells arc up through the sky, go through the low cloud, obviously out of sight, and then 10, 15 seconds later, you see them drop out the clouds at the other end of the scale.
So important to realize that you do have these spectacularly good optics, both in the directors and on turret two, so that the turrets could actually control themselves optically if they could see the target. But mostly you wanted to shoot at ranges where that target was out of sight. So you needed radar, you needed forward observers. We trained the Marines to be forward observers, and then with the RPV. And Drac, one important thing to understand about major caliber gunnery is quite different from, say, 5-inch or smaller guns. Though this is statistical gunnery. When you're firing major caliber guns, you're firing statistical patterns. So what you're doing is measuring the standard deviation left and right and fore and aft down that gun line. So if I were, for example, firing at a football pitch in the UK, down lined up lengthwise with that pitch, we could drop every shell in on the grass, nothing in the stands. And the way we did that is by very carefully managing powder temperature, by knowing the IVs that we got out of every lot. We had a little radar velocimeter. We measured the speed of every bullet leaving the barrel, and then kept records on that powder lot with those projectiles, what IV initial velocity we would get. So gunnery is an art and a science. There is nothing that you don't calculate in gunnery. What makes it so interesting. And you've got this huge crew of people that are working like a symphony orchestra in the turret and in plot, and the spotters.
Yeah. So with all that, obviously, also I guess were the Pioneer drones used for spotting with the gunnery, or were they used for other purposes?
The principal purpose, again, was that basic mission, the directive from the secretary, the battleships have to be accurate. And I'll tell you, as a gunnery guy who grew up looking at my fall of shot through binoculars, it's a huge difference to be sitting with the camera on top of the target, looking down and seeing the fall of shot drop in. And of course, the guys in plot could see that. So you could almost have the plotting room officer be his own fire control officer. We were a little more disciplined at. There was a command about a left and right adjustment to adjust the fire. But that was the purpose of the Pioneer. Again, interesting sea story. The secretary, after that problem, the Beirut firing, was in Israel, and the Israelis had invented, that was an Israeli system. They flew the RPV over the secretary during his visit, and then showed him the video. So he liked it and bought it, and in typical John Lehman style, ordered this thing. We didn't know about it. I still remember one day a couple of big steak trucks drove down the pier in Norfolk, and a lieutenant commander named Dana Griffith came aboard, and he was with the trucks. A bunch of big boxes were unloaded by cranes beside the ship. He said, "Hi, Captain, I'm Dana Griffith. I'm here with the Pioneer system. We're going to install that on the ship. I'm now yours." So we had to figure out where we would put that. We found some spot in the Admiral's officer quarters that we could repurpose into being the control center. We could launch with these little JATO bottles, and then we would put up big goalposts with a net between them, and the controller would stand with his little remote controller when he took local control and fly the RPV straight at himself into that net. So that's what we did, is we built this thing in, figured out how to use it. We crashed a lot of RPVs before we finally got all the bugs out of it and figured out how to work. But the effect was remarkable. It completely changes major caliber gunnery to be able to look down on the target. In fact, I mentioned this Avgo, the shooting in order to get the green light to go from SecNav. That final day of the qualifying firing in the Med, when we were up in the Aegean at that Avgo Nisi Rock, we used the RPV to see that fall of shot. And when we left, not only had we been very accurate, but we left that rock quite a bit smaller than it was before. I always thought we ought to send a letter to the Greeks apologizing for reducing the size of their island. We told ourselves we were in the landscape rearrangement business.
Fair enough. Yeah. Oh,
now, there were other technologies. Another thing we did, if I may, here's some other things. It was not only the RPVs, the addition of the missiles. When you added all of that strike power from very long range, as well as the guns, you needed the ability to control that. So what we did is repurpose the old Admiral's cabin on the O2 level as what we called strike. It was an upper CIC, an upper combat information center. The lower one, the original one, was down inside the armored box where the radarmen worked. But we added up there this strike center, and I built a different kind of command arrangement in which the strike officer was actually controlling the ship in the mission. The officer of the deck on the bridge was going where strike told him to take the ship. And we were able to do that because we had the first portable or luggable computers. And for the Navy, first time in the surface Navy, when we would get back in port after a period at sea, these contractor computer people would come aboard and we would talk through, and they would reprogram our computer systems so that we could see the battle space and control missiles, airplanes. We could see everything from there. So that was an important innovation. Another thing we did is realize that because the battleships were built as self-repair capabilities, there were something like 26 shops built into the battleship, everything from forge, you could cast some steel parts of your own, big machine shops. We added high-tech electronics shops. So I turned that part of the battleship into a repair ship that was actually funded by the type commander, and I could take aboard small repair projects from the small boys in company. They would fly or send by boat things that needed to be repaired, and we would do all that fixing aboard the ship. So that was another thing that we kind of invented, is to use the battleship as a mobile base. A couple of other things as I was thinking, Zach, about innovations. This will sound terribly simple, but it was important to the crew. Northampton bunks. Rather than sleeping on the World War II canvas bunks 6 or 8 high, there were Northampton bunks. By modern standards, still a terrible place to have as your home, but better than the World War II quarters. And we installed air conditioning. That was both a blessing and a problem. The designers back in the 30s and 40s were brilliant designers of air handling, so that they were very skillful at moving large volumes of air before the world of air conditioning through a ship to ventilate spaces, including engineering spaces. When we put the air conditioning in, the barriers screwed up those original airflow patterns. It took us a year to finally figure out ways we could have both air conditioning and the natural airflow that had originally been designed. And by the way, another innovation, down engineering space, we were burning a different fuel than the ship was designed for. The old black oil days of World War II. So it took the engineers, they did a brilliant job. It took them months and months of work to gradually retune the entire plant so that we could operate at full power. And we did indeed run Battleship Iowa. My recollection is that we were going 36 and a half, 37 knots. We could sustain that for an hour or more as a regular full power test. Very proud of that. I've had to be careful of that number because every time I tell the story, the speed gets higher. but we did have this 65,000, 70,000 ton battleship going 37 knots.
That would have been quite an intimidating sight. I can only imagine what the bow wave must have been like at that point.
Oh, very little.
Really?
Yeah, very little because of the brilliant hull design. It's not, you're not putting a lot of energy, you're not wasting energy. And you're not pushing a big bow. There is actually, it was an early precursor, of that bulbous bow kind of thing. But
yeah,
a wonderfully well-designed, hydrodynamically designed hull.
Yeah, well, it has to be to get something that up moving to that kind of speed. I suppose at that speed, I'm just trying to think, translating knots into miles per hour. I mean,
40,
not entirely sure how you'd manage it, but yeah, that would probably get you a speeding ticket in some areas.
Yeah.
Well, I would want to be the person trying to pull it over.
Well, interestingly enough, we were almost up to the speed that my first command, the patrol gunboat, which was powered by one J-79 jet engine. We could do 40 knots in that.
So with the ship obviously all worked up, what was the reaction of other navies and the general public when you were conducting various port visits with this massive ship, the sort of the size of which most people have probably never seen before?
Well, obviously very positive. It's a powerful impact. It's a beautiful ship. It's very impressive. And a couple of examples, in fact, beginning since you're in the UK, and your first experience, as I recall, Drac, was in Portsmouth.
Yeah.
We made a port visit in Portsmouth in the fall of 1986. I had to burn down some fuel to bring the draft up a couple of feet to get into Portsmouth Harbor. But going in there, I remember BBC News flew television crews out. They were broadcasting our arrival from the air. I was careful going in. As I recall the British history, HMS Lion, the last battleship, was towed out of Portsmouth, and in the tow, Lion went aground right underneath this pub that's on the breakers right there at the entrance of Portsmouth Harbor. So I wanted to make sure that I got through the entrance fine. But we had a fabulous visit, tens of thousands of people visiting us every place we went. In Germany, we did a state visit, for example, in Istanbul. You could use the ship as a political capital for the country. Another thing that was very important in Honduras, for example, we pulled into Honduras on the Caribbean side, and with helicopters, I flew something like 40 crew, 2 doctors, 2 chaplains, a dentist with a portable dental chair, up to an orphanage in the mountains above San Pedro Sulu. When you read these days about the Hondurans who are trying to escape Honduras, we were working in exactly that same area, painted an orphanage, rewired it, did a lot of doctoring and dentistry work. The crew, of course, was very proud of what they were able to do. So it's another example of not only being a pretty face in the harbor, but being able to do something significant with the local population that showed the value of America, our values, and our crew. And I'll tell you the most important thing, Drac, I always saw the crew as America's best ambassadors. When we put our crew ashore in any port, Istanbul or Portsmouth, this was America coming ashore. Good-looking sailors. We had this wonderful command master chief, Bobby Scott, the single best sailor I ever went to sea with. You could have put a 4-star admiral suit on him, and he would be easily able to run the whole Navy. Bobby Scott was a fabulous leader for the crew, and he was always on the quarterdeck. No sailor went ashore without Bobby Scott having said, and if the sailor wasn't quite ready to go ashore, somehow a wrinkle of Bobby Scott, Master Chief's brow, that sailor was back to get a second round of touch-up before he went ashore. So as diplomats, that kind of using the presence of the ship was very important as part of America's, presence around the world. One reason why we still ought to have battleships.
Yeah, they certainly make a statement.
I should mention, by the way, something that everyone saw. We talked about President Reagan. On the 4th of July, 1986, we did the International Naval Review. The Statue of Liberty was 100 years old. It had been given to us. No, the statue was not 100 years old in 86. Maybe it was. Been given to us by the French, Statue of Liberty. It had been refurbished, recommissioned. And so the idea was that on the 4th of July, we would have an international naval review. President Reagan would be on board the ship, and then later in the day, with a laser, he would relight up the Statue of Liberty. We had something, I was told, like 1 billion watchers on television around the world for that International Naval Review of having the president on board. Dozens of ships from navies all over the world, thousands of small boats. So that was another place where people really liked the idea of this beautiful ship representing the best of America with America's best sailors on board.
And obviously, it's not always fun and games and being able to show off the ship, but there's obviously it is a warship. So Iowa, as I understand, was deployed to the Persian Gulf during the tanker war. A little bit of a switch over from the port visits. Were there any particular close calls aboard Iowa with either Iranian or Iraqi vessels or aircraft, etc., during that period?
The whole thing was one protracted close call. I mentioned the shooting at Afghanistan and getting clearance to go through Suez Canal. I've got great sympathy for this giant merchant ship that got stuck because I also had a very large ship in a small canal and learned about bank effects and things like that. We got ourselves through very well, thank you. Thanks to some very fine Egyptian pilots. When we went into the Persian Gulf, this was in the November, December of 87 into January 88, February 88. This was deep into that 10-year-long Iraq-Iran war. The Iraqis had already hit one of our ships in the Persian Gulf. This is the third time in my career that I'd been in the Persian Gulf on deployment. I was there a lot in my younger career. And the Iranians were meddling with the tanker traffic in and out. Now, as we went in there, it was about the time we were sailing. There was one of the incidents where the Revolutionary Guard out of Bandar Abbas and the islands there, the Iranian islands, had interfered with some tankers. And there was the front cover of Time magazine, as I recall, that had a picture of a giant oil tanker and the American frigate trailing for safety, following the merchant ship. So I said to my crew, you are never going to find a picture with Iowa following a tanker through Straits of Hormuz. We're there to do the protecting, not to be protected. And so, by the way, talk about innovation stock. The bosun's mates remembered, the old timers, Iowa's class was built with bow-mounted sweep gear. So we went down to Charleston Navy Yard, where the minesweeping command was, their boneyard, found old Paravane sweep gear and jury-rigged sweep gear on both sides from the bow. So we could deploy with J-davits, deploy our Paravanes and sweep 300 to 400 feet wide channel from the bow. I could put the anchors down, sweep gear. Basically, we could protect ourselves. Now, when we got there, the way we operated is with the Iranians having something like 23 silkworm sites. We didn't know which ones had the missiles, but they could play hide and seek with these different silkworm sites. The Revolutionary Guard boats zipping around, occasionally shooting up a tanker with machine guns, occasionally trying to drop mines. Our mission was to bring calm to all of that. And what enabled us to operate was international law says that if you are more than, you're in international waters, able to operate as a warship, rotate radiators, rotate radars, train your guns, fly helicopters, you can be a warship in international waters. But if you're in a transit zone, you cannot behave like a warship. You must peacefully stay on those transit things. Well, there was a thing called a football as you're going north from the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, up into Straits of Hormuz, ready for a big hard left turn. There is a little slice there couple miles wide, and east to west, 4 or 5 miles long, that we called the football, that is more than 12 miles from Iran and Oman. That's international water. So I would peacefully go up the international sea lanes, get into the football, turn ourselves on as a warship, and Iran would simply shut down. All of the rev guards would stay quiet. F-4 flights stopped. Everything quieted down during those patrols. We would finish a patrol, go south for a break in the Arabian Sea around the corner in Oman. And gradually things would come back up. One of the interesting things was discovering, of course, the Straits of Hormuz have been the source or a route for smugglers since we first went to sea in log canoes. And there were these high-speed boats zipping back and forth between Iran and Oman. I called those gentlemen of commerce. They were not targets. That was just regular smuggling going on, what those people had been doing for thousands of years, just with a little bit higher speed craft right now. So you had to be very careful about all the airlines and things like that. So we did not have any incidents, but I tell you, we were on our toes at general quarters all of the time because of those risks. Something that really stuck with me as we were finishing the final patrol, ready to leave, we succeeded in that mission in there. The port lookout was a young man, probably 19 years old, 6 months, 9 months before he'd been a farm boy in Iowa. Now he was, finishing his tour in the Persian Gulf. He said to me, says, Captain, we were so good. They knew we were so good that we didn't have to shoot. And that's my answer, Drock, is that highly capable, highly skilled. They knew how good we were. They knew that we were the most accurate firing battleship in history. That was in the press, and what our capabilities were. That made a difference.
Yeah, so I suppose that's the thing, that you don't mess with someone that you know is immediately going to turn around, just like, you want to play, right? Let's play, because only one side's walking away from this one.
and it keeps things calm. You're not spoiling for a fight. You're trying. No. The mission of the American Navy is to prevent war.
So while everyone was obviously visits to ports, visits to the Persian Gulf and such like, were there any especially amusing incidents during the ship's voyages?
Well, you talk to anyone, crewman, I'm sure that he would have. They were all male in my time, and all male crews at that time. I'm sure you'll hear lots of interesting stories. But I enjoyed every day. There was always something going on. A crewman with an interesting story or something funny happening. They did all the usual things of, relative bearing grease and finding, the male buoy watch. And because we were a large ship, we had people arriving. Every week you'd have a few new crew arriving. And so there was always an ample supply of boots aboard the ship for the old timers to have fun with. A couple of things we did that I enjoyed doing. We had refueling gear. We were in unrep ship, we call it. So on the starboard quarter, I had a big refueling rig, had more than 2 million gallons of fuel on board, and I could refuel ships alongside. So we rigged up turret 3 with a small charge in one of the barrels and put a rig so that we could fire a shot line over to the destroyer when they arrived. Now, the normal way, as you know, when you pass a line from ship to ship, there's a monkey fist heaving line. A young sailor with a good arm, it can be quite accurate with that monkey fist. But we fired that thing over from the barrel of turret 3. And we did it at sunset. So it was getting dusk with a little bit of flame coming out of the barrel. Scared the hell out of that ship. He immediately, I was embarrassed to say, we enjoyed it, but he broke off and did not come alongside for a while. And we reassured him we were not trying to fire. We used to have fun, for example. We would pass word on the topside speakers because they all would look at the battleship like destroyer sailors. You know, you're always getting bounced around in every sea. And the battleship just rides like a table. So we would pass words on the 1MC speakers topside, like the billiard tournament has been delayed for 30 minutes. You know, it will begin at 16:30. Of course, these guys over there bouncing around in the heavy seas, saying these SOBs over there actually playing billiards. And so we had things like that. I wanted to tell you one story, particularly since you're a Brit. We finish our tour in the Persian Gulf, and we're headed back to Suez Canal, you know, around past Aden, went to GQ to get through that little zone in there of Aden in those days. And we're heading up the Red Sea, and we end up steaming alongside a couple of British ships that we'd operate, a couple of frigates. They were headed for the Suez Canal on basically the same timeline. So we just fell in together, had a couple of days operating together with helos, exchange a couple of people. And we were doing highline unreps. They'd come along just for young officers getting practice, you know, always training at sea. So what we did, in a little background, earlier in my career, I had been in the Seychelles. I said I spent a lot of time in the Indian Ocean. I'd been in the Seychelles on an earlier destroyer, and there was a British Royal Auxiliary ship in that harbor. And they were wonderful. The wardrobe brought us over, and of course, they could drink at sea on the ship. We were dry. So we were pleased to be the guest of the Brits. And I remember them putting on a show for us of various kinds of strange people visiting in the wardroom. So in order to return the favor, what we did when this destroyer, the frigate, the Brit came alongside, Royal Navy ship, and we rigged the high line, we took with one of the chief bosun mates of the forecastle, he put on captain's eagle on one side and the chaplain's cross on his collar. So he was dressed like a Navy captain chaplain. Put his life jacket on, jumped on the British highline rig where you just stand on a little T-bar, zipped over, and as he jumped off on the other side, he said, "Where the F can I get a beer?" and took off. And I called the other CO on the hand sound powered telephone. I said, "Captain, I'm so embarrassed. We have had this chaplain that I am taking back to the States. He's got a screw loose, and we're trying to keep him under control. My duty is to get him safely back to the US. He's broken loose, and he's over on your ship. Can you send him back to me?" So the chief runs around the British ship looking for a beer. We all enjoyed that.
Oh, I could just imagine.
We'd been at sea long enough at time, but we thought that was pretty funny. So.
Yeah, I could just imagine the hilarity trying to chase down this. I suppose you've got to chase down and supposedly apprehend a person who's ostensibly got a captain rank. So it's like,
you've got to handle him.
Excuse me, sir, you are being detained. Please come this way.
I do. You know, the Royal Navy, the sailors in the Royal Navy have a wonderful sense of humor. You know, if you're around a bunch of Brit sailors, you're going to have a good time. And that was to try to hold up our end of the relationship.
Fair enough. Yeah. So I suppose the one of the big questions, when you were coming up through the ranks, obviously most of that time the Iowas would have been in mothballs. Did you ever think you were going to get to command a ship like Iowa?
No, because we didn't even have them. I had always wanted from very early on, I wanted to be in command. My first dream sheet as a young officer, you send these little cards into BUPERS, Bureau of Naval Personnel, about what you'd like to do. And I wrote down command of any ship anywhere, no matter how rusty. And I was fortunate, as I said, as a lieutenant to get command of a gunboat and then to stay in command for a total of 4 times. And, as it turned out, I made the choice as a 4-striper that I did want, the normal thing was to go to sea as a squadron commander. I really like to be in command. And to me, my decision was around a 15-pound CO2 bottle, little red bottles. You have to be weighed and a tag marked every month that CO2 bottle is still fit for service. I wanted to make sure that those CO2 bottles were my CO2 bottles, not CO2 bottles that I was inspecting on somebody else's ship. So I was very fortunate to have the opportunity. And I'll confess that I worry today that that in our smaller Navy, with the compressed training schedules, that we're not giving young officers these days the opportunity that I had for command after command to keep learning, to learn more, to talk to other commanding officers, to figure out what you could do better next time. I think that experience really pays off, and it's important to a crew that CO be experienced. And I'd like to see, I hope, a resurgence of that kind of expertise.
Hopefully with the new Constellation class frigates coming down the line, that'll increase the number of slots open to officers who can take advantage of that.
Right.
So when obviously you get command of the ship and it's got all these new systems, were there any other systems you'd have liked to have seen added to the ship while it was being modernized that you could have thought you could make use of?
Yeah, I'm a real fan of gunnery. I would like to see us, I still wish that we were going to very long range guns. Even the first time I went ashore, I was flag lieutenant to the vice admiral who ran the surface Navy. I can remember going with Admiral King down to Dahlgren to the experimental gunnery place. Even in the 70s, they knew they could do 100-mile projectiles. And I thought we should put a lot more into big gun, very long range projectiles. But the Navy has gone to the missile side. There's a lot of advantage to having guns. And the 100-mile range from a ship takes there's quite a bit of the world that's inside your firepower influence range.
Fair enough. Yeah, I suppose that it's that extra punch, isn't it? Especially if you're doing mostly shore bombardment, if you're limited to kind of a hard limit of maybe 20 miles, and then minus a bit for the fact you can't be right on the beach.
Yeah, you've got the harpoon missiles, which are one missile, one target. That idea of having a sustained bombardment that would be part of that symphony of firepower, and I think would be useful.
Yeah. So I'm told that you had this idea of having a song at 1800 each day on the ship. So what's the story behind that, and what was your favorite?
Well, I had forgotten about this. I think sea shanties had occurred, the old sea shanties. And at one point, one of the variations on this was if your group could do a good sea shanty, come up and sing it on the 1MC, the top side speakers. Another thing we did, the ship was so large with a large crew that we had fun with the idea that it took a while to commute from Iraq to quarters in the morning. So we had a morning talk show. We had an internal newspaper, internal television station, and an internal radio system with professional journalists, some wonderful people in that public affairs department, brilliant photographers, and we were using television and radio. So we had a morning talk show, was like commuting to work. And there were a couple of guys with the usual jokes, and they would look at the plan of the day, the POD, and say, well, I see, why are we doing this? Let's call the captain. Then I would get a phone call and on the radio and say, Captain, why are we doing this today? And so we had fun with things like that. Call the XO and ask, why is this happening, XO? Yeah, we did things like that. We did a lot, by the way, with the wives, families, with ombudsmen. These days, everybody's connected with, with the internet devices and Facebook pages. But in those days, we really worked hard with 800 numbers. We would send a daily message back to be put on an 800 recording to tell the crew's families where we were. They were worried about us being in the Persian Gulf and within the limits of classification. We really worked hard at keeping those families informed.
I'm just imagining on that commuter talk radio. I wonder if I don't know, maybe at some point someone thought about sending someone up to the top of the mast. And they're just going, right, and now we're going to go to our eye in the sky. What's the situation on the port side gangway?
Well, sometimes the visibility, we did have an 08 level bridge, by the way. You could go up to the 08 level bridge. From the 04 level, you couldn't really see the quarters. When I had the president on board in the naval review, we operated the ship from that 08 level bridge.
It's I mean, hopefully obviously at the moment travel between the US and the UK is somewhat difficult, but I am hoping it's maybe this year, hopefully, but if not this year, then maybe next year to actually visit Iowa. So
excellent. People ought to do that. PacificBattleship.com is the website. The crews down there are doing a wonderful job of keeping the ship looking good. It's a lot of the internal spaces are open for tours. There are museum spaces. Drac, I wanted to go back. You mentioned the things like broadcasting from the high aloft. We used to do re-enlistment ceremonies wherever that crewman wanted to be re-enlisted. And I have done one re-enlistment at the highest point of the ship. There was an electrician who spent a seaman who spent a lot of time way up there on electrical connections, and he wanted to be re-enlisted up there. It is a long way up to the top of that tower, higher than underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. We also, once I re-enlisted a man on the anchor in port, we lowered the anchor down enough so that we could both climb down on a Jacob's ladder and stand down there on those giant flukes. So yeah, we did a lot of unusual enlistments.
I'll have to see if they'll let me up to that top position. I mean, to be honest, I'm terrified of heights, but I'm always up for a good challenge.
You strap in, you put your safety gear on, all of that stuff. Those safety rigs were built into the ship.
Yeah. So I guess that leaves us with our final question, which obviously a lot of people I can tell are going to be asking. Do you think the Iowa class battleships would still be useful today?
My answer is yes. In fact, my answer is hell yes. We're making a mistake. In fact, the battleships themselves were of such high quality materials. You should not look at the battleships in the 1980s as kind of an anachronism pulled out of World War II. If anything, the battleships were built 50 years before their time. It was only in the 80s and even now where that capital ship with enormous range, the symphony of firepower from long-range missiles to shorter range gunneries, major caliber guns, a crew that can do everything. It's got built-in repair expertise, doctors, dentists, 23-bed hospital, 2 surgeries, and this spectacular crew of people who are the best at their business. I had the chief's mess was about 60 chiefs, petty officers, 15 to 20 master chiefs. The wardroom included 20 or 30 warrants and LDOs. They were the best in the business. So bringing the battleships back would do 2 things. Not only would it be very valuable, you can see it moving around the world to now as American presence that would be very helpful, valuable in local stability, but it also would be a school of the ship. A big ship like that is a finishing school for sailors. And with that rich set of senior people who know everything about everything and have been going to sea, since Noah was a midshipman, there's just an enormous opportunity for young sailors to learn the arts of going to sea. So yeah, I would love to see the battleships, something like them, a capital ship back in service. That was a wonderful example of using something that it was a well-designed, well-built, and the welding was perfect. The cableways, electrical cableways were laid out just perfectly straight, just a beautifully well-designed, well-built ship that I think still could serve America. And if you can't do that, at least go visit it in San Pedro.
Yeah, I do want to try and complete the collection of the Iowa class. Getting to Missouri is going to be a little bit interesting because that's over in Hawaii, but I'll definitely get 3 out of the 4.
And there are battleship sailors around. I'm so admiring of all of my shipmates who are around the country. Just a wonderful group of people who, as young men, put their heart and souls into that ship, still serving their country.
Excellent.
We're all
Excellent.
proud to be Battleship Iowa sailors.
And rightfully so. So I guess, we've run out of questions. So yeah, time has flown by. So I guess it remains to say, well, thank you very much to Captain Larry Seaquist for his time and his expertise and his knowledge of how it was to operate the USS Iowa in real life, as it were. I guess hopefully you won't be too opposed. You haven't decided you completely hate me in the last hour and a half. So hopefully you won't be too opposed to maybe coming back for a follow-up, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people in the comments when this video gets published who'll be asking all sorts of fancy questions, which hopefully you might be able to shed a bit more light on. And I know we've said we're going to talk, obviously, about Turret 2 and what happened there at another point, but that's I think belongs to a separate discussion.
The battleship, just the design of the ship, so the things they could do it's really remarkable. So of course I'd look forward to it. I'll keep my coffee warm and ready to go.
Excellent, thank you.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.